Welcome to the Raniel and Duran podcast show. I'm Duran.
And I'm Raniel.
In today's episode, we'll be exploring CSV injection and looking a little bit into how we can leverage different attacks to attack the client system. It's important to remember when we talk about attacking clients that it varies from client to client and how the data is going to be displayed. For example, if I am attacking a client that reads a CSV or JSON or YAML or any other file, I need to recognize how that data is being used or displayed, as the case may be. If, for example, the data within the file is being used to run operating system commands or queries, or application commands or queries, then obviously my attacks have to, since I'm attacking the client, be addressed in that vein. If, however, the client is something such as the Microsoft Office Excel client or LibreOffice or anything of that nature, then my attack needs to be based on whatever that happens to be. So first and foremost, we've added in some new functionality and new features lately to the super vulnerable Java application. A couple of things that we've done is we've made it so that you can now create projects and things of that nature through API calls. Most of that code had already been built, but we finally hooked it up. The other component is we have created the ability to export. In this case, we have 3 different kinds of export that you can do. We have a XLSX export. We also have 2 versions of CSV exports. We're going to focus on those today. So the way this winds up working, you can either export via a show or via an index. Now, for those of you who are new to RESTful APIs, a quick reminder, in this particular case, we're using the show to show a given item. Conversely, we use index to show a series of items from within that item type. So in this example, for our index is returning a laundry list containing all of the projects that happen to exist in our database, whereas show would require me to specify a given project to return. Now you'll see we have these different export types here. It's a very basic Boolean. So all we'll do is specify that we want this CSV, basic CSV export, or we want a CSV export, or we want an Excel export. Now based on that, it calls one of 3 different methods. So our first method, this basic project CSV export, whereas the second one is a bean-based CSV export. So the difference between the two is in the basic format, it takes a series of strings. So it turns your project into a series of different strings. Those strings are then written to our export file. And the writer in this case is extraordinarily rudimentary. Now, normally you actually wouldn't see systems even do what you see here with these quotation marks. So you'll notice what we're doing is we're ensuring that the output for every item within that line, you will do double quotations surrounding that item. And then of course it's going to be comma separated. Now, I've seen a lot of instances where they don't use double quotes. And that obviously is the most dangerous from a client parser perspective. A recent example of this is I was doing some forensics work that required me to dump logs from Office 365, which is Microsoft's SaaS or software as a service solution for Microsoft Office. It's also leveraged to enable things like Exchange in the cloud and things of that nature. So we had a customer, I did some pro bono work for a nonprofit organization that was horribly compromised by a former employee. And in order for us to gather a lot of the data, we had to pump out various audit logs and things of that nature from the Office 365 environment. What I found very quickly was they don't use quotation marks around the data. And that, of course, becomes very problematic because those quotation marks make it so that if there are any commas within the data, they get ignored. So we would have this string, and the string would happen to have commas in it, and the data itself would be ignored. Now, they do put quotation marks around some of the data, but it's not all of them. I believe, if I remember correctly, I saw something similar from some of the Google Cloud logs on another case that I had to work. So it is important that no matter what, just for the sake of anyone who has to actually parse out your data, that you entomb all entries within quotes. The only thing that does is make it so that your commas are not lost if it's contained within the data itself. This kind of rudimentary protection, however, does not protect against anything like someone doing CSV injection. The CSV injection is a very important and very real thing, especially since so many times CSVs are used for logs, to display logs or to export log data. And so as someone who's doing forensics, that makes it much more difficult, especially if an attacker knows what's going on, because they can start to inject into your logs, into your log export. This is a very common attack, and it's been around for a very long time. I remember CSV injection being used to hose up people's logs as far back as 2007. And I'm certain there were instances before that. That's just the first that comes to mind. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to authenticate. In this case, we're authenticating as admin. We got our token back. So right now, we're not working on any other forms of attack. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to feed in my token. You'll see we have some data here, and this is actually important. So this is if we were doing client-side attacks. So normally, when people open up CSV files these days, these comma-separated value files these days, they do so automatically in Excel or some other spreadsheet-like system. And oftentimes, those systems offer these services, these capabilities like this. And interestingly enough, all of the functions that you use in Excel for an Excel spreadsheet are actually available to anyone for tab-separated, comma-separated, and other such file types. So if I'm an attacker and I input this, you'll see, even though we have cross-site scripting protections, those protections don't do anything for us here, because the problem in this particular case, of course, is we aren't injecting JavaScript. What we're injecting is actual Excel functions and things of that nature. Now, one thing I will mention is, even outside of the CSV stuff, we have an Excel out, because of course we now allow you to punch to Excel. This system does something semi-similar, just in this system, using this right to out, we add in the different cells as we grind through. But we used to have in, when I originally posted this code, I had in a little piece where this cell data winds up getting checked out for any HTML. And I say HTML, but I put that in quotes. What I really mean is ML. HTML, of course, is your hypertext. XML is extensible. Now, XLSX, which is what Excel now uses, is nothing more than XML. So all of that fancy spreadsheet data, they turn each one into a different XML file. And then it parses each one of those files. And we might get to that a little later on today. But that's beside the point. Other than to point out that you can do XML injection in your XLSX file and attack the client further that way, or muck up the logs if the logs are exported in an Excel fashion, doing XML injection. But you can also use actual Excel functions, for example, to go through and mutate and modify the data in the logs. You could replace log data using virtualized functions and things of that nature to, for example, do lookups to make fake logs or to hide log table entries. That is an exercise we'll leave either for the viewer or for another day. But the important thing here is merely to show that when we create this project, it's going to have this description that you can see here. This is now what its description looks like. So if you viewed this within a standard viewer, if we had a viewer for this, which we don't yet, at some point we're going to build a user interface for this. But if you had a user interface, that interface would see this data such as it is shown here. And that would look odd to a user. And that's something very important to remember with these client-side attacks. They only work if they're in a client designed for that attack, or that is, so to speak, vulnerable to that attack. Obviously, running a VLOOKUP on something like Firefox or Chrome isn't going to work if that is how you are displaying it, because your user interface would not understand that. So instead, it would print out that VLOOKUP call, just like it would print out equals hyperlinks, so on and so forth. That would just stick out. But recognizing that more often than not, when we are attacking something like the client, we are attacking specific clients. We usually go for a client that is more frequently used, or we create a project that is not likely to be viewed outside of that client, or is only likely to be viewed infrequently. So we can see here we're running, this is our bean-based CSV export. And when we take a peek at this, we note here the web service is designed to go and pull data from a web service. And in this particular case, of course, that's not going to work very well, not since we're pointing it to pizzahut.com. If we pointed it to somewhere more useful, we would get a different result. Whereas this actually creates this link to, of course, pizzahut.com. If someone control clicks, then they will be redirected to Pizza Hut. Now, I would recommend if you are opening something like a CSV and you see something like this is LibreOffice. Excel has its own set, that you not go through and allow updating. That's not particularly great. Allowing updating would allow it to go through and make its call that we saw on the web service. It is important that you recognize that attacks against Excel, LibreOffice Calc, or any of those other tools, and that includes, of course, Google's spreadsheets, do not have to use macros. There are plenty of functions and plenty of functionality already embedded in these interfaces that someone can leverage without using macros. And too often people assume that if we have macros disabled, it's okay to open a file. It's actually much better to not open a file using something like Excel or LibreOffice Calc, and instead use just your standard gedit or notepad based system. Another important thing to note is when we look at this export file, we can see here everything is very nicely done. So we have these nice beautiful quotation marks, and it's also escaping our quotation marks, and it's double escaping. Now the only reason why this is happening is because our regular CSV exports are actually occurring through a different mechanism than our string-based ones. We're using a bean-based export in this particular case. So we have this CSV builder, which uses a very nice tool. If you haven't ever used it, you'll find It's actually much more effective than many out there. OpenCSV. So OpenCSV allows us to quickly and easily create something that automatically escapes. You'll see here we have this escape character that we've set. We have double quotes. We tell it to use double quotes. We tell it to go through and have this line separator, as well as, of course, the default CSV comma delineated separator. So all of this is well defined. And the nice thing is this writer that comes out of this will automatically just scour our items, in this case, our VOs, whatever it is, and then it will serialize or deserialize that automatically. And that is very important. What that means is we can actually create a CSV in that will deserialize CSV files back into project VOs or file VOs and things of that nature. And nicely, you'll see it grabs everything. And it's not recursive. We can tell it to recurse within a given class if we want to, but that's not turned on right now. That's not enabled right now. So it doesn't recurse down and try to deserialize, for example, files. We could tell it to if we so desire. So we've seen that particular one. Let's try it with a basic CSV export. So the basic CSV export, you may remember, goes through and it uses CSV out just like before, but it in fact pumps straight to the writer itself. So instead of properly leveraging our CSV builder, which then handles things like escaping, this one does not. Now that's important because it means that we can very easily do injection. So we do know in this particular case that all we have to do from an attacker perspective is add in our own quotes, just like what you see here. And if we put commas in, we can throw off the quote count and create our own new lines, as though we had entirely separate log entries. But let's first see how this actually looks inside of an Excel-like tool. So we see here, just like we were saying, this has been mucked up. So we have hyperlink here, and because of that double quote, that ended the quotation mark that we had inside of here. So that ended this quotation mark, which meant that when it then sees the next comma, it's going to pay attention to that particular comma. And that's exactly what we see here. This comma now matters. And it's as though it's the start of a new thing, which in this case is SVJA login. And now it goes to the next comma, which is right here. And so on and so forth. Whereas in this case, we should see reference bill all grouped in one, because of course, this whole string is entombed in double quotes. So as an attacker now, we have inadvertently managed to screw up what should have been a hyperlink because of the quotations, the double quotation marks that we had put in around the word Pizza Hut. And instead, we wind up with an extra row sitting out here. So this is where our CSV injection comes in, as compared to, for example, going through and attacking the client. We can continue to attack the client. You see already we have our hyperlink actually properly working, and we can allow updating. See how it now pumps in, just to show the point I was making earlier. So as you can see now, it's displaying the content of pizzahut.com. And this can be used by a malicious attacker who instead wants to clog up or clutter up your logs, or it can be leveraged by someone who's trying to do a number of things. It could be cross-site scripting. It could be cross-site request forgery. It could be trying to probe your internal network, or any host of other things. This can also be leveraged to grab a rootkit and install a rootkit onto your system, such that now, using this, one would have said previously innocuous CSV, I can gain complete control of your computer because yours reached out and grabbed the payload sitting on my computer designed to attack your system, whatever it may be. So it is absolutely positively important that you recognize attacks like this are not only very possible, but they are very easy to do. So what if we change this and let's instead do CSV injection instead of attacking the client itself? So we don't need to attack the client. The client's easy enough. So our title is pretty short. So let's say a new project. Okay, just like this. Probably should put it in uppercase. It is a title after all. We have to give it that grand uppercase. Now, so I want to do this as someone who's malicious, and I'll tell you an easy way to do this, very easy way to do this. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick peek as to the general structure. So I expect my description is going to be the third item here, right? After this description, we have this other data. So let's do this. Let's say a nice little project, right? Now we're going to end that quote. We're going to put in our own thing that comes after that. And let's say the ID is going to be 2. We're going to call it, I don't know, Bobby B. It's not a username, but that's what we're going to say. Again, we're just injecting our own little thing. And we know that typically the format is something like this. So I'm going to be a little lazy. I'm going to copy this out and I'm going to paste it in. All right, so now let's think about this a little more. So let's do, so add in our own new line. We'll say 3, number 3, and we'll call it, well, we'll just call it after that. So something like this. So it's a weird description. All right. So we see our data sitting in here. So we're going to run this and let's see what our CSV looks like. Okay, so we see that it's injected. Actually, it's injected very nicely. Okay. So let's take a peek at how this actually looks. We're going to close. We're not going to save. We're going to open. Open. Oh, I need to add in a description. I guess it did not have a description. So we're going to say okay, post it along. And here is our new entry. You'll notice we actually could have written as many lines as we wanted. This is a completely fictitious project, and we could have made it look exactly like all of the other rows if we had wanted to. There's nothing that really stopped us from doing that. So if we had wanted to, we could have put quotation marks like we did. We put this quotation mark right here at the start of this particular sentence. We could have done that with all of these to make them look exactly like every single other entry in here, so that someone who is looking at the logs couldn't tell that we've literally injected data into the actual export. And again, this becomes very, very crucial, especially when we talk about audit logs and anything of that nature. And this is a very common problem. I had another instance where an organization was pumping data straight from their application into the Windows logs. And if you don't know anything else about the Windows logs, those are XML. And the reason why that's important is it means that you as an attacker can actually do XML injection straight into it. And then when someone goes and views the Windows logs through the system event viewer, you can embed attacks in there, but you can also create fictitious log entries and do it. It's called log injection. Log injection is an absolutely positively important thing, particularly within our industry, because a good skilled attacker can make it so that forensics experts who aren't meticulous won't even notice that the log data they are looking at is completely fabricated. The other component was if you put in data in a certain way, it wouldn't even show up in the Windows logs because it wouldn't write to the Windows logs. So if I, for example, input something that was over 10,000 characters long, it would never show up in the Windows logs. The attack would succeed, but it would never be logged anywhere at all. So it is important to recognize that when you are doing an export, that the data that comes out of it needs to be properly escaped. If we look, for example, at this same exact thing, but we look at it with this CSV export, so instead now we're using our bean-based export because of the way Open CSV works. Our nice little bean is actually going to be well protected. And you'll notice all of this description in a single line tied to this file. So now I, as a reviewer, can see someone's been trying to monkey with this because all of this was properly escaped. When I look, for example, at the export through something like this, it might not be noticeable if I look at the raw file. In fact, actually, you probably wouldn't notice it. Not if this were thousands of lines long. But when I look at it in something like this, I can see very clearly that someone's been tampering with it. So CSV injection is a real and important thing, and it's something that people definitely need to be aware of. They should also be aware that it goes beyond just CSV injection. I may be attacking your actual application by creating new data, new CSV entries, which is what we saw here. But I may instead be doing something particularly more pernicious and attacking the client that happens to be viewing it, because I can safely assume that in most cases, if it's CSV, it's going to be viewed in something like OpenOffice, LibreOffice, Microsoft Office, or some other tool like that. And it will be getting viewed in a spreadsheet application. And that application, more likely than not, will allow a variety of functions. And the fact that the file is CSV doesn't change the fact that Microsoft Office, Google Sheets, or LibreOffice and OpenOffice's spreadsheet software will properly parse those functions, whatever they may be. And I don't need to inject macros. I could put macros into it. And that's another important thing to remember. Someone can actually put macros in as well. But most macros are going to be stopped, or at least users have been told not to enable macros by default, not to allow macros on such an application. But I can still run all kinds of things like having links and doing VLOOKUPs and things of that nature, and use those to attack the client and to attack the user, the end user who's viewing it through a client. That's the totality of our demonstration for today. If you like what you saw, please hit like and feel free to subscribe. We have a few other examples that I think most people would find enjoyable. We have insecure deserialization, and we have actually 2 videos on the matter. They cover different aspects of it. We've gone through and we've adjusted our code to make it easier to do certain attacks, such as insecure deserialization. But what you'll find is this particular application has changed a little bit. So those examples are a little harder to work than when we first created it if you're trying to follow the video to a T. I strongly recommend when you see these videos that you grab the version of the super vulnerable Java application that was created around when that code was committed. Or if you're maybe looking for a little more of a challenge, I would also recommend that you try the latest as well, because all the vulnerabilities that you saw back then still exist in the system. It's just how to tweak them. Sometimes is a little different. We also don't demonstrate the more beautiful attacks. Our goal here is really to just give you an idea as to what can be and let you play, let your imagination play. So you'll see here, for example, we have a variety of vulnerabilities that you can execute with each one of these API calls. And you'll notice we actually have a number of really nifty vulnerabilities that you don't see too incredibly frequently. And it's up to you, the listener, you, the person playing with this application, to give it a real go and see what you see what you can get to work. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to comment and we'll gladly get back to you. If you have any recommendations or anything you'd like to see in a future episode, also please let us know. Thank you all. I hope you had fun. I hope this was enjoyable. Have a fantastic day.